Hello and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. And today we're going rogue. We have a very special guest who is going to tell us about the wife of a man who basically changed the shape of Europe. So joining us today is Margaret Skea, who grew up in Ulster at the height of the Troubles, but now lives with her husband in the gorgeous Scottish borders. Apparently, chocolate is vital to her creative process. Margaret is joining us to talk about her duology of Katharina von Bora, wife of religious reformer Martin Luther. Welcome, Margaret.
Deliverance is all about her escaping from the convent, which I'll come to in a minute. And Fortitude is what she needed, really, for the life she had with Martin Luther. Hence the two titles.
Right.
My children had some other titles they thought would be quite amusing, but they were vetoed. Yeah.
So who was Katharina von Bora?
Katharina was born into an aristocratic family in the part of Saxony that was ruled by Duke George. And he was very much against the Reformation. And when she was 5, or just before she was 5, her father was widowed and he remarried. And she was sent away to a convent aged 5 and never saw her father again.
Wow.
And when she was 10, she was moved to a different convent where actually 2 of her aunts were already there. There's lots of speculation about Katharina because there are 2 villages who both claim that they are her birthplace. Because in both of those villages, there was a couple with the name of her father and mother. And so there's proudly plaques in these 2 villages saying birthplace of Katharina von Bora. So the very first choice I had to make was where was I going to have her born and grow up to age 5. So I went with a village called Lippendorf, which is the current favourite, you could say, for her birthplace. Interestingly, very interestingly, when she was sent to the convent at age 5, she was sent to one that was 50 miles away from either of the 2 villages that might have been her birthplace. When she was 10, she was moved to a convent much closer to home, which was the one where 2 of her aunts were already there. So that gave me the possibility of thinking, well, why was she sent so far away? And the wicked stepmother angle was just too delicious to ignore. I don't know if the stepmother was terribly wicked or not, but certainly Katharina was sent far away. She spent the rest of the time until she was age 23 in that second convent, took her vows and so on. But at 23, she and 11 other nuns wrote to Martin Luther and asked him to help them escape. This was the first mass breakout from a convent following the Reformation teachings. Luther had written a wee pamphlet saying if you'd been put in a convent as a child, you shouldn't be held to your vows. So they wrote to him and said, basically put your money where your mouth is and get us out.
Mm-hmm.
Which he did, although it was a capital offence. So he could have been executed for helping them escape. And so she and these 11 other nuns came out. 3 of them went home. 9 of them didn't because their families refused to take them back, because to harbour an escaped nun was also a capital offence. And Katharina was not able to go home. So Luther had 9 nuns to try and find support, housing, husbands, some whatever for them, which was an interesting conundrum for a sort of renegade monk. And 2 years later, short story, she was the last nun standing, you could say. So he married her. Marriage of convenience on both sides, initially, obviously. He needed a wife, she needed some means of support. Most of his friends told him he shouldn't marry her. Marry anybody you like, they said, but not her, because she was too strong-willed. She had too many opinions of her own, which she wasn't afraid to voice. And they all thought that she maybe wasn't going to be very good for him, but in fact she was. She needed to be strong-willed, actually, to be married to Martin Luther. It became a very, very strong, loving relationship.
Right. So what in particular attracted you to her story? I mean, it just on the face of it, it sounds pretty amazing as a sequence of events in someone's life. But was there anything in particular that you thought, yeah, this is such a great story?
Well, I have to be absolutely honest and say that before I started researching her, all I knew was that Martin Luther had a wife. And that was just a drop into the conversation comment that somebody had made. I don't even remember who, in 2016. And I thought, Martin Luther had a wife? I didn't know that. And then I was at London Book Fair and I was speaking to an agent and they said to me, what are you going to write about next? And she just popped into my head and I just said, Martin Luther's wife. And they jumped on it and said, well, you know, that would be a really good story. And if you're going to do it, you have to do it now because 2017 is the 500th anniversary of the nailing of the 95 Theses to Wittenberg church door. And I was in the middle of writing my third Scottish book at the time. And I woke up the next morning and thought, okay, I'll set aside book number 3 and I'll research Katharina. And then I discovered that the reason I didn't know anything about her much was that nobody did really. Certainly not about her early life. And there is a little book which was written by the director of the Luther Foundation, and it has 56 pages. And that is the definitive biography of Katharina von Bora. And he starts it by saying that nobody can write a biography of her because the information is so scanty. And he kind of threw down a challenge that novelists writing about Katharina wrote more a reflection of their life and times than Katharina's. And I thought, I don't want to do that. And I'm going to prove him wrong, that I can actually write about her life, her times, and not about me. So that was the start. And because there was so little written about her, and certainly not in English, I decided to go to Saxony to do the research. And that was fabulous.
Wow. In doing that, you've written 2 books on Katharina, Deliverance and Fortitude. So what were the challenges in researching Katharina's life? And how did you manage to find enough to fill 2 books when her biographer can only fill 56 pages?
Originally, I intended it to be 1 book, but once I started, I discovered actually there's a lot more you can do with this than I initially thought. Researching it was interesting. Both of the convents that she was in no longer exist. So that's a wee bit of a problem for a start. Obviously, these 2 villages vying with each other for her birthplace, that's not terribly helpful. What I did have was lots of portraits of her. She was clearly very influential in her own time. So I knew what she looked like as an adult, but I had to work backwards. I knew what her father had done after she'd been put in the convent. So I could kind of piece together the family background. But in terms of the architecture and everything, that was tricky because the second convent she was in, which was the most influential one, there's a wall, one wall, sort of semi-ruined, and that's it. But you can get the geography round about it and so on, but only by going. Wittenberg was easier because the Luther House is still standing, though it was altered at a slightly later period. But the Luther House still stands, so I could go into all the rooms in the Luther House. The house that she stayed in before she married Martin Luther still stands on the square in Wittenberg. It's now a hotel as it happens, but too expensive for me to stay there. But I was allowed in and up into some of the bedrooms and be able to stand at windows and look out and see what she would have seen. Extrapolated back a little bit because the rat house was also renovated. it was really important actually to get that on the ground stuff. And because this was former East Germany, a lot had not changed. That if it had been West Germany, would have been long renovated, and
Yeah.
so that was helpful. And a lot of the artifacts were still there, so I could handle things she handled.
Oh, wow.
For a country that had been irreligious for a long time, it was amazing that there was still some of Luther's clothing there in the Luther house. And his birthplace and where he died and so on, they were still standing. I actually stayed in the place he died, which was interesting. That was one of the highlights of my trip, actually. Not because he died there, but because it was the townhouse of one of the aristocratic families. And it had been turned into a very posh hotel. And they gave me this room because I'd written and said I wanted to research Katharina von Bora. And by now, the Luthers are now a tourist attraction. You can get Lego men and this kind of thing for sale there, and Lego ladies. They gave me the room, which turned out to be almost the whole of the top floor of this hotel. And it's actually the postcard of the hotel, that they give out to guests. My room was the postcard. And they did it because that was what I was researching. And I paid the cheapest book a bed a head for that room. But everywhere I went, actually, when I was researching, and everyone I spoke to, they all bent over backwards to help. But what was most positive was that I don't speak German. I got there and discovered that I hadn't even thought about before, that the second language of most people would be Russian.
Oh.
So I didn't know any Russian either. So fortunately, I'd written ahead to all the key Luther sites and said, look, I don't speak German. Can somebody meet me who speaks English? And in each case, it was the head person on every site, because they were the only ones who spoke English. So it really worked out in my favor, not speaking German. Not that I would recommend going researching somewhere where you don't speak the language exactly, but it turned out to be the best thing I could have done.
But you could have gone so the other way.
Yeah, I mean, I got the people who really knew what they were talking about.
Yeah.
And people spent hours with me, and I had a ball. And this is a tangent, really. It's not about Katharina. It's just about the general research. But there were things I would have got wrong in terms of architecture and lifestyle and so on if I hadn't gone. For example, leaded glass in the UK from that period is either diamond, square, or rectangular. Leaded glass in that bit of Saxony is circular. Now, why they make it so difficult for themselves, I do not know. But if you think about the sunlight coming through the windows and the shadows that are cast on the floor, they're circles. I would have written about square or rectangular or diamond, and I would have been so cross with myself for getting it wrong. And other little things like Martin Luther's favorite food was songbirds. Not what we really want to hear, but it's true. And even more so, the children were given lures, which they blew, and that mimicked the song of the songbirds to bring the little birds in so that they could net them. And children were sent out to do that. That was one of their jobs. And it was just really interesting to handle a 16th century lure and kind of swallow deeply before you thought about what it was for.
Yeah.
Getting these details right, I needed to be on the ground.
And what about her later life? How easy was it to unravel what she did, say, after Luther died? I'm just thinking in terms of the research, was it more difficult or easier?
Once she got to Wittenberg, we know quite a lot about her.
Okay.
And when she married Martin, we know a lot about what she did. We know that she ran a brewery. We know that she ran the Luther house as a kind of bed and breakfast. because people from all over Europe wanted to come to listen to Luther. And it was a huge, huge building. And Luther wanted everybody to be accommodated for free. But she said, well, we can't do that. You know, we don't have the money. So I'm going to charge them board and lodgings, which is what she did. And the place was full every night. She also instigated the buying of a couple of farms, and she farmed them because Luther didn't have time for practical kind of things. So she was a farmer, she was a brewer, she was sort of chatelaine of a very substantial hotel. She also had 6 kids. She did have a few servants, but not a huge number. She was very, very proficient and very good at everything she did.
That was the convent upbringing.
Well, yes, because she'd had to do a lot of work in the convent, physical, practical jobs in the convent. And brewing was one of the bits she liked best in the convent, actually. Luther liked his beer. So she was very proficient, and Luther just gave her a completely free hand. So we do know a lot about what she did. We don't have a lot of her conversations. We have some, but we don't have a lot of them because unfortunately he was away a lot and she wrote a lot of letters to him. Unfortunately, those letters went with her daughter to Prussia and got burnt in a fire, unfortunately. So we only have 8 letters that she wrote extant, and only one of them is actually about anything personal, and that's about Luther's death. The other 7 are all practical things about the price of pigs and so on. So I had to look at what she did and also what other people said about her, because we have a lot of that. A lot of people either spoke to Luther or wrote to Luther commenting on Katharina, mostly unfavorably. I had to piece together that and think, well, if this is what she did, and this is what people said about her, and then this is what Luther said about her, which was consistently positive.
Let's talk about their relationship then, because one of the first things you said was that Luther had a wife. So, I mean, I also didn't realize he had a wife. And yet, this relationship between the two of them seems to have been a strong one, as far as I can gather. So how did that happen? How was it? It must have been difficult to get into that relationship between these two.
Well, we do have quite a lot of letters that Luther wrote to Katharina, and they were always really positive. And he said some interesting things. He called her my Lord Katie, which gives you a little inkling into her position in the household. He also said something quite remarkable, which is documented. He said, in the home, I bow to my Lord Katie. But he often addressed her as that in letters. In everything else, I bow to the Holy Spirit. And that is a huge kind of comparison. And one of the very remarkable things I found out was that because he was away a lot, but he was the person who was supposed to choose pastors for village churches and so on. And there was a particular church that needed a pastor. He was away. Katharina was at home. He made up a short list and he sent it to Katharina and he wrote, "You're a better judge of character than me. So you decide who should be that pastor and then tell Bugenhagen to ordain them." And, you know, a lot of people round about thought that this was not a job for a woman, you understand. But he gave her so much responsibility. There's plenty of evidence through table talk, which is something he did every night after dinner, and people came in and asked him questions and so on. She was the only woman to sit in on table talk, and she did make comments and ask questions and sometimes put her own point of view, and we have that documented. It wasn't always the easiest of marriages, but then, you know,
Whose is?
which one is? There will be disagreements, but we do have evidence from other people of things that they said and did about each other. And so it actually wasn't that difficult. And he was very much a family man. You know, he believed in children should have their own music. He believed in education for girls as well as boys. He believed that the wealthy people in the parish should pay for the education of the poor, all of which it's not hard to imagine that she supported and perhaps even instigated.
And yet they must have been frowned upon by certain people, because he's a monk and she's a nun and they're married. It must have been challenging at times.
Actually, they were the scandal of Europe when they got married. Partly because the Catholic Church had a legend that the Antichrist would be born of the union of a renegade monk and a renegade nun. So when she was pregnant for the first time, most of Europe was waiting to see this child born with horns, which obviously didn't happen.
That must have been a disappointment.
Yeah. I mean, they were the talk of Europe, and obviously the Catholic Church was not positive regarding them, but also some of the reformers were not positive regarding them. Some of the reformers weren't altogether sure that priests should marry in the first place. There was a lot of religious kind of conflict among the reformers, and we know that Katharina took part in those discussions. And that didn't always go down very well. And she had to take quite a lot of antagonism initially. But she clearly rose above it. As far as I'm aware, she's the only wife of a reformer of that period, of whom we have a portrait, and there are dozens of hers. So clearly she became very influential in her own time. And actually in Lutheranism, right down through the ages, their marriage has become the paradigm of a clerical marriage, which says something.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of the blueprint, I suppose, for those who came after, or even at the time, I suppose. It must have influenced people during their lifetimes that, yes, a priest could marry and this is how you do it, sort of thing.
And actually, you were asking about after Luther's death. Prior to that time, a widow could not inherit, whatever they had, and was not in control of it. She had to have somebody who was kind of in charge of her and the money after her husband's death. Luther was the first will that we know of where he left everything to her and left everything in her control. Now, she had to go to court to fight to get that ratified, because it was completely in contrast to what was the norm. And she did go to court, and she did fight to have complete control of the money, the farms, the children, Luther's printing, all the stuff that was printed of Luther's writings and so on. He left her in complete control of that, and she fought to keep it and did eventually win that battle.
I mean, that's a pretty high compliment in a sense that he's paying her, isn't it? That he trusted his work to her as well as, the personal side of their relationship.
He trusted his work to her actually while he was still alive as well. He left her in charge of organizing print runs and so on. One of the big disagreements they had, and this is one she didn't win, was that Luther refused to take a penny from the money that was generated by his writings, which was substantial. And she tried to argue, and also the main printer tried to argue with him, that it was quite reasonable to be paid for this. Throughout his entire life, he refused to take a single Pfennig, I should say, being Germany, for any of that. And I mean, some of the print runs of his pamphlets were 40,000 copies, which is huge.
So then you wonder, where did the money go then? He made that much money from it, but he wouldn't take it.
Through the printers.
So the printers got the money.
Through the printers, yeah.
But were the printers taking a risk by printing his stuff, or by then was it okay?
Initially, they were taking a huge risk because that wasn't politically correct either. The main printer in Wittenberg, it wasn't so bad for him because the Duke there, while he did not class himself as reformed, he was nevertheless sympathetic to Luther and he protected him. And so you weren't so much in danger in Wittenberg printing stuff, but printers in other areas in Saxony were very much in danger. So yes, it was a big risk, but eventually, because they were being disseminated all over Europe, it got to be too big an enterprise for anybody actually to stop.
The thing I find fascinating is that when I was a teacher, I used to teach about Martin Luther and what are the 95 Theses and so on. But this brings a completely different dimension to the man, to hear about what his wife was doing and how she contributed and how she helped organize and all of those things. It's kind of as if we've only got half a figure without knowing that. So it's really fascinating to hear how she was involved.
Also, this will fascinate you even more. We have evidence that Luther changed nappies. So, in many ways, he was a new man, way, way ahead of his time.
Well, I think he was anyway, with listening to letting Katharina run businesses and
Yes.
listening to her. And that's obviously why he got these letters where they're criticizing her, because people on the outside are seeing it as she having power over him rather than them being in partnership, which of course in medieval times, which they'd just come out of, was very, a woman wasn't supposed to have her own opinions and ideas and her own business. She was supposed to be subservient in all things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And actually, his relationship with Katharina drove a wedge between him and one of his closest friends for a considerable period, because he was old school and he thought that Katharina just, she had far too much power and influence and was given far too much leeway to do things, and it just wasn't appropriate. He did eventually come round, but it took a while. I think Luther needed somebody who matched him in terms of their will and their strong-mindedness and their having their own opinions and so on. A doormat would have been no good to him at all, really. He also needed somebody who was strong enough to, how can I put this, help him when he suffered bouts of depression quite regularly, actually. And he wasn't very healthy, probably because he had just about starved himself on many, many lengthy periods while he was a monk, because he was trying desperately to win favor with God and so on. And so he wasn't terribly healthy. But there was one point when he was in this bout of depression and he had locked himself in his room and he wouldn't come out. Katharina got someone and said, just knock that door down, break it, because he needs to come out. Otherwise he'll kill himself, by starvation. She just got a joiner in and said, I want you to smash that door down because he needs to come out and he needs to come out now. So, we have glimpses of the strength of her character and things like that we know absolutely did happen.
But even so, a lot of the time a joiner would probably say, well, no, I'm not going to do that on your say so. But clearly she was such a strong personality that he was inclined to go along with her request.
Yeah. And I mean, they did so much together. When plague hit Wittenberg, they turned the Luther house into a plague hospital and brought in, all these plague victims.
Wow.
And so, yeah. And because they both felt very strongly that they had the room and the resources at that point, and it should be used for the good of the community.
I think we often do it, don't we, where we stop Martin Luther started the Reformation, and that's as far as you go. We've in the 95 Theses on the door and everything, and we go back to Tudor England and Henry VIII using it without actually looking at, at least he practiced what he preached, Martin Luther. And that was the start of it, but he carried on, and Katharina was obviously a partner in continuing the Reformation and also challenged his views on what should happen and where they went.
Yeah, we even have wrong ideas about the 95 Theses, actually. Well, maybe Derek doesn't because he was a history teacher, but...
Oh, I'm sure I do.
I do, because I was about to call it the 96 Theses, so I can never remember whether it's 95 or 96.
The thing was, pinning those 95 theses to the door was a perfectly normal thing to do. All it was signifying was that the discussion and debate on that particular week in the university in Wittenberg was going to be on these issues.
Right.
You know, so it wasn't a big deal to do that pinning up. But what happened was Luther then decided to send these theses to the bishop, and then they got to Rome, and that was when it all... Had the debate just stayed within the University of Wittenberg, it wouldn't have had that much impact. But because it got to Rome, that this is what he thought and said, then, you know, the balloon went up big time.
I think the act of pinning them has sort of become a bit cartooned, really, in the sense that, I mean, I've seen it written in different ways, like he nailed them to the church door. Now, when you say somebody nailed them, that's him making a big statement. It's not just putting up a list, is it? So this has been sort of characterized as you say, an iconic moment when at the time it possibly wasn't perceived in that way.
Well, no, but they didn't have either blue tack or...
Totally different.
Sellotape.
They didn't have these things, so it had to be nails because that was all they had, you know?
He would have got through a lot of blue tack.
And it's still falling down 3 times before it stays up, and then you'd get the nail anyway.
One of the kind of, I mean, although it was a very normal thing at the time, it was still quite exciting to stay in a bedroom in what was now a hotel across the street and be looking out on that church door as I was kind of researching and thinking through and so on, and seeing that.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Iconic or not. One of the things I should have said about research, I was incredibly fortunate when I was there that there was a big hangar, circular hangar, and it had it was a day in Wittenberg in 1517, and it cycled through, you know, the whole 24 hours, and it had all the different important places and events. And it was absolutely amazing. And it was so authentic and accurate. The guy who'd done it, whose name has escaped me, who's done some of these in different places. I mean, it was just amazing. I was able to see Luther in his house reading to his children. I was able to see him obviously nailing the thesis. I was able to see people paying their indulgences. I was able to see the dirt and the clart and everything on the streets and the housing and the architecture and so on.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing.
You must have had shivers going down your spine every day you were there, because you're surrounded by the history you're writing about. It does help. I mean, I know that from my own writing, that actually visiting these places gives you a better impression and understanding of the times that they lived in, especially when there's so much surviving.
Yeah, and there is a restaurant in Wittenberg that only serves food of the era.
Wow.
I didn't eat any songbirds, but that was really good as well.
So we asked this next question quite a lot to probably everybody, more or less everybody we interview, which is, when you're writing about someone who existed, how far do you go into fiction and how far do you stick to the facts? But with this particular story, Martin Luther is such a huge, world-renowned figure that it must have been even more difficult to know when you could go into fiction and when you dare not. How did you deal with that?
Actually, I just went with my gut instinct on Martin. And the more I discovered about him, the more I thought, actually, this guy is not black and white. There's so many nuances in his life and so on. And I got to quite like him. And the great shame, actually, is that the Nazis claimed him. Because he wasn't actually anti-Semitic in the sense we think of anti-Semitism. He was very cross that the Jews did not, in a spiritual sense, recognize that he was telling them that Jesus was their Messiah, you know, and that they should recognize that. And he became very, very angry about that. And towards the end of his life, obviously, he wrote one fairly unpleasant pamphlet lambasting them. But it was actually a religious lambasting. It wasn't a nationalistic one. And in fact, we do have evidence of very many Jews that he supported on a personal and practical and individual level. But unfortunately, the Nazis got hold of that pamphlet and built a huge monster on it. That, I think, is the saddest thing about Luther's life. And I couldn't avoid, or I felt I couldn't avoid, that he had been taken and used in that way. And he was taken and used in that way even in his own time. Sometimes, you know, he opened his mouth and he spoke, or he lifted up his pen and he wrote. He refused to change anything he'd written. That was his Achilles heel, I think. And I couldn't avoid that, and I didn't avoid that. But as far as Katharina was concerned, and her relationship with Martin, I had to find a voice for her. And so I started writing random little snippets in first person to try and get myself into her voice.
Yeah.
And then I discovered that I was writing the whole 2 books in first person. And in many ways, she was like my grandmother. I had a very feisty grandmother. My grandfather was a lovely man, but he had strong opinions, and my grandmother had strong opinions. And she stood up to, I mean, she was tiny, but she stood up to him. And in many ways, I looked at my grandmother and thought that's a similar sort of way that Katharina is approaching Martin. So that's fiction, clearly. But I do believe that I have a solid enough base on fact. And I have not put anything in either of the books that isn't plausible. My biggest fiction is the Wicked Stepmother. But even there, I think that it's a reasonable jump to make, because why was she not sent to a convent nearby with 2 of her aunts? One was the abbess and one was the infirmaress. That would have been the logical convent.
Yeah.
Why send her a long way away?
And why send a 5-year-old girl away when she's just lost her mother?
Yeah. And keep the boys at home because the boys are useful on the farm, you know?
But that was common, though, wasn't it? That was fairly common, that the girls...
It was common that girls were sent to convents if your family wasn't terribly wealthy, but were aristocratic, because it was cheaper to pay the dowry to a convent that they demanded for taking her than it was to pay a dowry for a good marriage. And spoiler alert, there was an aristocrat who met Katharina in Wittenberg once she'd escaped, and everyone in the town thought they were going to get married. And his family, it is thought, blocked that marriage. Luther even wrote to him to say to him, you know, you need to come back and marry her. We're all expecting this betrothal. So that was, you know, one of her sadnesses. But in the end, perhaps it was a blessing in disguise for both of them.
She found the right man.
I think she found the right man. And he certainly found the woman.
And I think he had it right, that putting a 5-year-old girl in a convent and then saying she's a nun from that moment on, you're indoctrinating them into that way of life anyway. So when they do take their vows, they haven't actually taken the decision really, because they haven't known any other life.
No, because he wrote, it is very shameful that children, especially defenseless young girls, are pushed into the nunneries. Shame on the unmerciful parents who treat their own so cruelly.
It's not very typical view, though, is it, of the time?
No.
His view?
No, not at all. Most of his views weren't typical of the time.
Yes, I guess that's the point, really.
You know, but he had wide-ranging views that were way ahead of his time. And you're right, Sharon, you said he changed the course of Europe. He did, and not just in religious terms. I mean, his translation of the Bible into German, which was done, well, the New Testament certainly was done while he was in the Wartburg, where he was thought to be imprisoned, but he was actually being shielded, really. That was the start of modern German.
Yes, because there was no Germany at that point for
No.
a long, long time after that. So the idea of German is a cultural thing rather
Yes.
than a national
But in
thing.
terms of the language, that was the start of the modern German language, his translation. And the whole idea that people should be able to read books in their own language was huge.
Yeah, that was a key
Yeah.
part of what he was arguing, wasn't it?
Because he wasn't writing all these pamphlets in Latin.
No.
He was writing them in vernacular German. I mean, he wasn't the first person to have those ideas.
No.
But because they weren't able to disseminate them beyond their own area, 100 years earlier, he'd have been burnt at the stake, like the rest of them. But because of the printing press, his ideas were able to fly.
But do you think it's also because he was protected? Because he was protected by some of the German princes, wasn't he? Whereas someone like Wycliffe was sort of waiting to be mown down, really.
Yeah, so I mean that's clearly important, and Katharina was protected as well, and most of their income actually initially it was a gift from the Duke. He gifted them the Luther House, which Martin thought was perhaps going to be an albatross round their necks, but Katharina immediately saw the possibilities of that place and made it into a paying proposition. But yeah, without the support of the Duke, things could have been very different. If he'd been in the other half of Saxony where Duke George was in charge, it would have been different.
But that's history, as they say.
I think we all expect history to be tied up wrapped up in with a nice, pretty bow, and it never is. There's so many nuances. It's only when you look into it, something as deeply as you've looked into Martin Luther, that you discover those nuances.
I mean, I was surprised to find myself liking Luther. I expected to like Katharina once I started delving into her life. I didn't expect to like Martin, and to my surprise, I found I did.
Well, my life has changed just knowing that he changed nappies, really. I mean, that revelation has changed me forever, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they had a pet dog, and he played with his children endlessly, and he really was a very hands-on family man, which was countercultural at the time.
So what are you working on now, Margaret?
Struggling through book 4 in my Scottish, I suppose you have to call it a series now, likely to be a trilogy in about 5 parts.
Yeah.
I'm working on the 4th part now. There is a mystery that has never been solved, a thing called the Gari conspiracy, which you might or might not have heard of.
I've heard of that. I don't know anything about it, but I've heard the name.
Right. Well, on a particular day in August 1600, James VI went to a particular house, the Earl of Gary's house in Perth. And as a result of events there, the Earl and his next brother were killed by James' supporters. And the story that James tells is that he was tricked into going there, that he was tricked into going into a particular room in the house where they were going to kidnap him, and he leant out a window and called treason, and some of his followers came up the stairs and dispatched the 2 Garys. The Gary story is that James had set the whole thing up because there was history between the Garys and James, and they had previously kidnapped him and so on, and they had threatened.
As you do.
But their story is that James set the whole thing up as an excuse to kill them because of the misdeeds of their father. And 400 years on, nobody knows which is the truer version of events. Now, I am not going to give a definitive answer to which side of the story is true. What I'm interested in is there were 2 younger brothers who were not even there at the time. They were 15 and 16, and James hounded them for the next 18 years or so, and he put out edicts against them that if anybody helped them or gave them shelter or anything like that, that they would be executed or whatever. So I'm interested in the two younger brothers, really, and what happened with them and through that. One of them spent 18 years in the Tower of London and was eventually released. So I am going to involve my fictional hero from the trilogy with these two boys. And that's kind of the story I'm working on.
Mm.
What's been brilliant about that is I've been doing research in the National Archives in Edinburgh. I was looking for references to the Gowries, and you're trawling through lots of letters and all papers and so on. But while I was trawling through, I came upon a letter written by James VI. I mean, an actual letter written by James VI. Nothing at all to do with the Gowries, but it's signed "Your friend James R." And just touching that. And of course, you don't have to wear white gloves anymore because they've decided that that's a bad thing, that it's much better to wash your hands very carefully before you handle these things and just handle them with your own fingers. It's just been so fascinating sitting in the National Archives, immersing myself in 1600.
Why did you decide to continue the trilogy with that idea?
I think I wanted to move down a generation.
Right. Yeah.
And a la Poldark, really, go for the children.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do something with Robbie. I'll not tell you where I'd left him at the end of book 3, just in case you haven't read it. But I wanted to do something with the son, Robbie. I also want to do something with the older daughter, Maggie. Yeah, I wanted to do something with them, but it needs to be slightly different from what has gone before.
Yeah, that sounds good.
And of course, in Scottish history, there's so many stories that you can pull from. I think in England in particular, we tend to concentrate on English history, and you talk to somebody about Scottish history and they've heard of Robert Bruce. But beyond that, it's like, oh yeah, Macbeth. I mean, I'm biased because I've just finished a book, Scotland's Medieval Queens, looking at all the queens from St. Margaret to Margaret of Denmark. I thought I knew a lot about Scottish history, and I was amazed at how many different conspiracies and fascinating stories were in there to pull from.
There is so much, and it is not valued in England. I mean, I remember when I wrote the first Munro book, and one of the responses I got from an agent who was very positive about the writing and everything, but she said, this will only sell to a Scottish publisher because people don't know the names of the main historical characters in it. And I thought that's very parochial in a way, to say this will only sell to a Scottish publisher. Whereas if I'd written about William Wallace or Mary Queen of Scots or Robert the Bruce, I might have had a chance at an English. And sometimes you think you should market it as Scotland under the Tudors or something.
If you get the word Tudor in there, Tudor sells. It shouldn't do, but it does.
I hope so. My Tudor book is out on Saturday, so I hope so.
So finally, is there anyone that you've thought about writing about, but decided you couldn't because you just didn't have enough information about them?
There's not one person, but there is an event that I would give my eye teeth to write about. And it's the first murder trial in New Zealand under British law. And it was the trial of the son of a Maori chieftain who had murdered the widow, the child, and a Maori child, the widow of a Scottish sea captain. And his father handed him over to British justice. And I would absolutely love to delve into that story, because the mother-in-law, the mother of the sea captain, this is the 1840s, the mother of the sea captain went to New Zealand on her own to try and find out what happened to her family. The whole kind of scenario that his father handed him over to British justice absolutely fascinates me. And I realize that there's all kinds of difficulties in trying to, as a white person from here, trying to tackle a story like that. There is the transcript of the trial, but that's almost all you have.
Was he found guilty and executed?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And although his father had handed him over, there was all kinds of fallout from that over quite a period thereafter. And I think that would be an amazing story to write. I would, of course, have to be given some money to go to New Zealand.
Yes.
I've got a feeling, because I had my secondary education in New Zealand, I've got a feeling that I did actually learn's probably an overstatement, but I did actually study that event at some point. I must have done, because we used to study the Treaty of Waitangi, which was around that time.
Yes, I mean, it was as a result of the Treaty of Waitangi that that trial was held.
So there's a lot of politics in it, isn't there?
There is. So while there isn't a huge amount of information aside from the trial transcript, I think perhaps I'm wary of it. But it's the one that burns inside me.
The one that got away.
Well, I hope it hasn't got away.
Well, maybe that's the thing. Maybe it's one of those things that you should start writing and see where it goes.
Well, I mean, the other thing is to try to talk to someone like a Maori historian in New Zealand and get their kind of input, which would help you to maybe have a two-dimensional look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I had this kind of idea that I'd like to write it from the dual perspective of the mother who went out and the Maori mother.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I should do it.
Yeah, I think so.
Have to get to New Zealand first.
It's not difficult. It's just the other side of the world, that's all.
I mean, I reckon I would need about a month out there.
Probably. Anyone who would like to sponsor Margaret Skea's journey to New Zealand to write this book, please contact her.
Maybe I should do a Kickstarter.
Yeah.
You never know.
I guess the other thing is, has it been written about in New Zealand?
I asked some of my New Zealand friends and they say they haven't found anything.
Because that's interesting in itself, that it hasn't been examined.
Again, there's a little booklet, a little narrow booklet.
Is it 56 pages long?
I don't know if it's even as much as that.
That's brilliant. And I think that's a good place to end. So with extra research on Margaret's project that we're all hoping actually comes to fruition, because it sounds fascinating. And I'd love to see how you tackle it, especially if you're doing it from the view of the two mothers. I think that's a really good angle and something you don't usually see. Thank you very much for joining us today, Margaret. That was absolutely fascinating. I think I've got a new appreciation for Martin Luther, and particularly for Katharina von Bora, such a strong, independent woman.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, good to talk to you. Yeah.
No, it's been brilliant. Thank you very much, Margaret.
And we'll see you all in Devon.
Yes,
definitely. Right, well, we will let you go.
Okay, nice to see you both.
Okay, then. Yeah.
Absolutely lovely talking with you, Margaret. Do join us next time when it will be Derek and myself looking into how unready was Ethelred the Unready. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening. And do subscribe to avoid missing a podcast. If you enjoyed it, perhaps give it a like. We'd love to have a rating or a review from you. Join us next time.